Today you'll experience a life simulation, the life of a medieval witch hunter. In 1620, you were born in a small village in eastern England. Your father was a devout Puritan who fed the family by farming. Every Sunday, he dragged you to church to kneel on the hard wooden floor and pray for 2 hours. From childhood, you were told the world was full of the devil's servants, hiding among ordinary people where you couldn't see them. When you were 6, an old woman in the village was accused of being a witch. She was just an herb seller. Anyone whose child had a fever went to her. But when the village head's cow suddenly died, someone claimed to have seen her lurking near the barn at midnight. The next day, a mob dragged her from her home, tied her to a stake, and piled firewood beneath. You watched the flames consume her with your own eyes. Your father told you that old woman was a witch and deserved to burn. He pulled out a book titled Malleus Maleficarum and said it was God's will. He said identifying witches was the most sacred duty of a Christian. You believed him because you didn't know who else to trust. You read that book many times. It described dozens of methods for identifying witches. In 1636, plague swept through your village. Your mother and sister both died. Half the village perished. Your father said it was Satan's curse. There must be witches working dark magic. He went door to door like a madman and ended up accusing 3 widows. Those 3 women were hanged from the old oak tree at the village entrance. You stood beneath, watching their feet swing in the air. After the plague passed, your father fell ill too. On his deathbed, he held your hand and said, "Remember, the world's greatest enemy isn't plague, it's witches. They brought the plague. You must continue purging them for God." You knelt by his bed and swore to carry on his mission. You were 17, alone in the world, with nothing but a tattered copy of the Malleus Maleficarum. You began wandering between villages, apprenticed to an old witch finder. His name was John, over 50, thin as a stick of firewood. He taught you how to interrogate suspects and find the devil's mark on their bodies. He said everyone who signed a pact with the devil had a spot kissed by Satan, a spot that wouldn't bleed or hurt when pricked with a needle. At 19, you participated in your first official witch trial. The accused was a middle-aged farmer's wife. Her neighbor claimed she'd used witchcraft to stop their chickens from laying eggs. John produced a special needle and pricked her dozens of times until he found a spot that didn't bleed. He declared it the devil's mark. The woman was found guilty and hanged. You stood watching, feeling you had done something righteous. Later you discovered John's needle had a secret. It was retractable, like a spring-loaded blade. When pressed down, the needle tip retracted into the handle. It never pierced the skin at all. So of course there was no blood and no pain. You asked John if this counted as cheating. He smirked and said, "Do you think every witch will conveniently not bleed? This just helps God speed up the trial process." That night you couldn't sleep. You remembered the face of the hanged farmer's wife. She was crying her innocence until the very end. But then you remembered your father's dying words. You told yourself, even if the needle is fake, the witches are real. John was just using a little trick to reveal the truth. You chose to believe this, because if you didn't, you'd have to admit you'd participated in murder. In 1642, the English Civil War broke out. Amid the chaos, you decided to go independent. You gave yourself a title, the Witchfinder General. Riding a thin horse with your trick needle and Malleus Maleficarum, you began touring villages across eastern England. You negotiated rates with local magistrates, 20 shillings bounty for every witch caught. Business was surprisingly good. In that era, everyone feared witches, and villagers rushed to report their neighbors. Every village welcomed you warmly. Magistrates treated you as an honored guest. You invented a complete trial system. Starve and deprive suspects of sleep for 3 days, interrogate them, then administer the needle test. Anyone kept awake for 3 days will confess to anything. Your most common trial method was the water ordeal. You tie the suspect's right thumb to left big toe, then throw them into the river. If they floated, it meant the water rejected them, proof of witchcraft. If they sank, they were innocent. The problem was, bound in that position, most people floated. The rare ones who sank drowned. So either way, the result was the same. You turned witch hunting into an assembly line. At each village, You held a public meeting encouraging villagers to report one another. Then you arrested those most frequently reported and tried them in batches. A single village could yield 5 to 10 witches per visit. You could cover 4 or 5 villages a month, earning more than a landowner. You hired assistants, bought a carriage, and got a better horse. Your most effective confession technique was sleep deprivation. Lock the suspect in a small room with guards watching. No sitting, no leaning, no closing eyes. After standing for 3 days and nights straight, anyone will hallucinate. Then you'd walk in and ask, "Did you sign a pact with the devil?" With glazed eyes, she'd nod and say yes. You'd record the confession, hand it to the judge, another 20 shillings earned. By 1645, your reputation had spread across all of eastern England. Parliamentary-controlled regions all invited you to hunt witches. In just 2 years, you tried over 300 people, with at least 100 executed. You became a celebrity in pamphlets. Some called you the Witchfinder General, others the Scourge of God. Walking the streets, everyone knew you. You felt you were justice incarnate. You made a fortune, charging per head, 20 shillings per witch. Sometimes a wealthy town paid £23 as a package deal. You bought a large house in Ipswich and hired servants. You wore the finest black coat, the latest felt hat, and a silver chain at your waist. If your father could see you now, he'd be so proud. You even wrote a book called The Discovery of Witches. It detailed your trial methods and successful cases. In it, you portrayed yourself as a holy warrior appointed by God. Every witch you executed deserved their fate. The book went through several printings and spread widely among Puritans. What you didn't know was that this book was later carried to the American colonies, directly inspiring the Salem witch trials decades later. But cracks began to appear. A clergyman publicly challenged your methods, saying the water ordeal had no biblical basis and your needle test was a fraud. He wrote a pamphlet refuting you point by point, saying you weren't hunting witches, you were profiting from murder. You trembled with rage, but you couldn't accuse a clergyman of witchcraft. No one would believe it. More and more people began questioning you. Someone did the math and found you'd collected over £1,000 in bounties across 2 years, an astronomical sum at the time. People began saying you weren't working for God, you were profiteering from war. Families of those you'd convicted came forward to appeal their cases. They said those confessions were all extracted through torture. By 1646, the English Civil War was essentially over. Society began restoring order, and people's fear was fading. Judges were no longer so easily convinced. Several of your cases were dismissed. You found the witch-hunting business increasingly difficult. Where a village once yielded 10 witches, now you couldn't even find 3. Your income was in freefall. One of your assistants was arrested. He'd gotten drunk at a tavern and boasted that witch hunting was just a business. Those witches weren't real. He said your needles were fake, confessions were coerced, and the whole process was a scam. These words reached the ears of a judge. The judge sent men for you, but you got word early and fled in the night. You fled to another county with your money, changed your name, and tried to start over. But your face was too well known. Everywhere you went, someone recognized you. The villagers who once welcomed you now looked at you with completely different eyes. Some threw stones at you, others spat in your face. Only then did you realize the wind had shifted. You'd gone from hero to villain. In the summer of 1647, you were finally caught. Ironically, you were charged with witchcraft. They said the only reason you could find so many witches was because you yourself were a warlock. You'd signed a pact with the devil, who told you who the witches were. Was this accusation absurd? Of course. But compared to the evidence you'd used to convict others, this charge was actually more reasonable. They used your own invented trial methods on you. First, 3 days without sleep. You stood in that same room where you'd interrogated countless people, your legs shaking like sieves. Then they produced a needle to find the devil's mark on your body. You knew the needle was fake, but you couldn't say it, because if you admitted the needle was fake, then all your previous trials were fraudulent. Finally, they subjected you to the water ordeal. Your right thumb was bound to your left big toe, exactly as you'd done to hundreds of women. You were thrown into the freezing river. You knew what would happen, because you'd written these rules yourself. You floated, The crowd erupted in cheers, shouting, "Warlock! Warlock!" You thrashed in the water, hearing those shouts you once knew so well. In August 1647, you were sentenced to hanging. On execution day, it was drizzling. The gallows stood in the same town square where you'd once passed judgment. The crowd was packed below, some faces you still recognized. You saw women crying in the crowd, but they weren't crying for you. They were the families of those you'd put to death. As the noose tightened around your neck, you remembered your father's words. The world's greatest enemy is witches. Now you finally understood. The greatest enemy was actually fear. The instant the rope went taut, your feet left the platform. You felt searing pain in your neck, then everything went dark. In your lifetime, you'd sent over 100 people to the gallows. Now you hung there yourself. Below, someone was applauding. You know what? That applause sounded exactly the same as the clapping when you'd sentenced others to death. After your death, the witch-hunting movement in England rapidly declined. People finally realized that so-called witch trials were nothing but a scam born of fear and greed. Your book, The Discovery of Witches, became a cautionary tale, used specifically to demonstrate how absurd witch hunting was. And the very trial system you built with your own hands became the instrument of your own execution. In history, this is called poetic justice. The witch finder was one of the most ironic professions in human history. They profited under the banner of justice, weaponized fear as their tool, and sent the innocent to the gallows. And in the end, they too were consumed by the same fear. Centuries later today, whenever society falls into panic, people still instinctively search for scapegoats. The witch hunt never truly ended. It just changed its form.